Hey everyone, welcome back to the Untrivial Podcast. My name is Ali Nelson. I hope you all are doing well today. This past week, I celebrated my 33rd birthday, which is very exciting. So I've been a little bit MIA, but just spending lots of time with my family, my friends, my husband, my son. And it has just been so nice to connect and been really reflective around my birthday. I always feel like it's a really grounding time. And I just know that right now life is somehow really fast and slow at the same time, but being on maternity leave is such a fleeting experience. So I am really just trying to soak it all in and spend a lot of time with my baby. And speaking of family, having a son, this conversation today is all about boys and men. And my guest today is Dr. Susie Bennett, and she is a researcher focused on male suicide. So her PhD focuses on the cultural and social determinants that put men at risk for suicidal despair and the factors that can aid men to recover a meaningful life. Today, we discuss the common factors impacting men's mental health and suicidality, cultural pressures, rigid masculine norms, and fear of failure, how women factor into the equation, how to support the men in your life and shift the cultural climate, and so much more. I know that right now in the culture, men's wellness, men's loneliness, men's mental health is taking more of center stage. And I think sometimes we as women can brush that off or kind of go along with the reasoning that we have maybe had it harder or these issues are not as big of a deal compared to women's. And I really just try and challenge that even within myself to remove as much bias as I can and try and treat these conversations as a listener the same way I would want someone to treat them if they were about me and they were listening to me. And so that's kind of the lens I had going into this, especially as I have a son growing up in this world. But even if I had a daughter, I still think it's really important to understand and learn and explore what is facing 50% of the population. Like we're all here. We all have to get along. And so I really enjoyed this conversation with Susie. She just explained things to me in such a way that really clicked in ways that they hadn't clicked before and just really opened my eyes to a lot of the pain that men can experience. And so I'm just trying to take a really human first approach, humanistic approach. And so whether you're a man or a woman listening to this conversation, I really hope you take something away from it. I think it's a really important conversation to have right now. And so if you do enjoy this episode, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps me grow the show and share these types of conversations with other listeners. And now let's get into the episode. Dr. Susie Bennett, welcome to the Untrivial Podcast. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, I am so glad you're here and so glad we're making a little bit of history for you. This is the first female-led podcast you said you've ever been on, so I'm so excited to have you.
Yeah, it was interesting when I realised that. So I've done quite a few male fronting podcasts. It was actually really beautiful to have this invitation, and obviously this issue impacts all of us, irrespective of gender, in different ways. So I'm really keen to share some of the findings with your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like you said, this affects everybody. Obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about men and suicide today, and that's quite a heavy conversation, but a really important one to have. So thank you so much for being here. For those in the audience who may not know you, I would love if you could just share a little bit about your background and how you got into the space of male suicide research.
Yeah, so I am a researcher at the University of Glasgow. So there's a suicide research lab there, run by Professor Rory O'Connor, and my work's supported by an organisation called Man Up, who are a men's mental health charity who have given me 2 years worth of funding now to support my work. So I'm a suicide researcher, but I look specifically and have always looked specifically at suicide in men. So I think that pretty much every country in the world, with one or two exceptions, men die at higher rates of suicide than people of other genders. And that's been, not only is that geographically around the world, it's also historically going back through time, a pretty consistent pattern that we see. So there's this clear sort of gender dimension to deaths by suicide, at least, where men are dying at much higher rates, which then leads to a very obvious and big question about what is it about the male experience that is putting men at such risk of deaths of despair. And that's really what my research kind of looks at. And there'll obviously be biological potential reasons for that, things about the male biology that may elevate risk for men. And then there are also things potentially about the way that men are socialized and the cultural ideas and expectations that men are raised in and internalize, and also that all of us are raised in and internalize, and that can then shape how we come alongside men and interact with men and what we expect of men and so on. And that's really the area that my work focuses on, is looking at how people's psychology, in a sense, is shaped in that way. So I don't look at the biological factors, but there are, of course, really important things going on there. And then in terms of what brought me into the work, I mean, the work started really as a personal endeavor I had people in my life that had experienced suicidal crises. I also someone that identifies having thoughts and feelings of suicide since I was 18 up until, very recently. I think it's something that I kind of live with and learn to manage. So for me, there was a real personal question about wanting to understand what is it that brings someone at times to the point where they feel in so much pain they don't know if they can keep staying in existence, and what we can collectively do as communities and societies to support one another to navigate this bewildering thing that we call life with more tenderness, towards one another. And for me, there was such a big question with regards men and suicide that really has been so sort of poorly taken up in terms of research. And I know that there are lots of areas of women's health that are really not being sufficiently researched. And so there's a lot of suffering that comes because that work hasn't been done. But, also when it comes to the case of suicide and suicide in men, there's been a real poverty of research in relation to the scale in which the problem
Mm-hmm.
exists. For example, in the UK, suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. So every man I know under 50 is most likely to die of suicide than anything else. And you would have thought that that kind of
Right.
prevalence would prompt a big kind of response around trying to understand why.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I did a little bit of research too, just for any listeners in the North America, Canada, US. Suicide is the second leading cause of deaths for men under 50, only behind accidents. And so it's
Right.
still a huge issue here as well.
Yeah.
Um, but I would love if you could share a little bit about your research and kind of what it is that you do, how you go about finding kind of information on this, speaking to men. What are some of
Mm,
the findings that are coming out of your work
mm,
about this issue and what it's telling us?
mm. I mean, researchers have different approaches to how you kind of explore these questions, and they're such complicated questions that you kind of need to come at them at all sorts of different angles. And there's no singular researcher or research project that's going to uh, reveal the causes of every death by suicide. For me, the way that I describe it is to think of. Well, let me back up for a minute and say, historically, I think we've approached this question, the idea of suicide, as through this sort of mental illness framework that understands suicide as something that resides in the body and brain of the individual, some sort of unwellness that exists internally. And to some extent, there's some reality to that. When I have, deep sort of suicidal pain, it's happening within the brain and body of me as an individual. But that the origins of that pain are deeply tied to things external to that individual. They can be tied to the environment that you grew up in, what kind of caregiving you received, the socioeconomic situation that you were raised in, what happened to you at school, were you able to make friends, did you have experiences of bullying, your romantic life, are you able to attract partners, sustain relationships, can you trust other people, and then, have accidents happen to you, traumas happen to you, are there aspects of your identity that are culturally discriminated against? All these different factors and more contribute to the pain then that resides in the individual. And I always say that for me, every suicide is like its own individual symphony of sorrow. So every individual person in suicidal pain has had their own lived reality, their own unique experiences that have happened to them, their own unique kind of biology that can lead them to the point of feeling immense pain. So I always say that no researcher can ever say within all of those orchestras what the sort of violin player in the fifth row of every single orchestra is playing, because
Mm-hmm.
there's too much complexity. What we can start to do, I think, as researchers is kind of just step back out and start to, as you listen to more and more symphonies, you start in a way to hear like a common melody in the wind section or the brass section, and you start to build up a sense of, here are some of the common sounds that I'm hearing across those symphonies, but I can never say in every single one, this is,
Yeah.
what's happening. For me, Ali, as a researcher, I cannot understand how you can understand a problem without talking directly to the people that are experiencing it. So for me, the sort of all of my work is built around that idea of having conversations, whether that's through interviews or through surveys. You're talking directly to either men who live with suicidal thoughts and feelings or have made suicide attempts, or to people bereaved by male suicide, and trying to understand through their recollections the experiences of men that they've lost. And for me, that's kind of where you begin, by understanding that live reality. And so we've looked at lots of different questions in our research. We've looked at sort of help seeking behaviors among men. We've looked at experiences in childhood. We did a big sort of synthesis review of 20 years worth of research at male suicide, trying to identify some of the common patterns and common risk factors. And there are so many questions still that we need to explore.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And when you think about those commonalities, or those similarities in the wind section, that is such a beautiful way to put it, that symphony of sorrow, how devastating, but beautiful kind of descriptor of what we're talking about here. But if you could identify maybe like the top three
Hmm.
kind of broad commonalities, what would you say those
Hmm.
are? One thing I hear people talk a lot about is male loneliness. Like if that's something that's come up, what would you say are some of those commonalities?
Hmm. Absolutely. I would say that, so when we did this big synthesis of 20 years worth of research, and so we were looking at all of the qualitative studies, so that's primarily sort of interviews or focus groups, and we were looking at 20 years worth of research. And bear in mind that thousands of papers on suicide get published every year. And over a 20-year period, we could only find 78 qualitative studies looking at male suicide. So that kind of indicates to you not only the sort of lack of research that's happened on this issue, but also the
Mm-hmm.
lack of qualitative work, which is when you were speaking directly to people that are living an experience. And again, I just want to go back to that point of like, I do not understand suicide researchers who think that they can understand something as complicated and as painful
Mm-hmm.
and as dense as suicide without talking directly to the people living that reality. And yeah, for me, a very dangerous approach to not do that. So sorry. So we did this big review, and so we had these 78 studies, which is still quite a lot of work to look at, and we were looking across them for sort of common themes in terms of risk factors and recovery factors. And from the study, we found sort of three core areas where risk related to specific cultural norms of masculinity seem to be harming men. Now, my hypothesis, Ali, is that these three areas, I think of them as a chord. I don't know if you play the piano, but if you can imagine a chord being played, a three-note chord, and I would say that chord of suicidal pain has the same three notes in it, irrespective of gender. The first note is about your relationship with your emotions. The second note is about your relationship with yourself. How do you think and feel about yourself as a human being? And then the third note is about your relationships with other people. How much meaningful, intimate, reciprocal, caring love do you have in your life? And I think that those three notes are the kind of foundational notes of all causes of suicidal pain. Like I say, irrespective of gender. I think if we then look at how men are socialized, in terms of their relationships with those three psychological areas of their life, then we can start to see the way in which men potentially inherit harms in those areas because of these cultural ideas and cultural expectations of masculinity. So if we think, for example, about emotions, our relationship with our emotions, like Ali, suicide is a death of pain, basically. That's how I understand it. It's somebody who's in that moment of suicidal crisis. You are in so much intense pain that, and it's intense pain that you do not know how to regulate. And so it feels unbearable. And because the pain is so intense and your tools to regulate it are so ineffective, because the pain is not diminishing, then in that sort of cocktail of distress, you can start to think of suicide as the way to escape the pain, essentially. And when I say someone's tools are ineffective, I mean often the tools that they've acquired through life. Like we have to learn healthy regulation from how we are cared for by other people. And if you are not always cared for in a decent way, it can become very sort of harmful for the tools someone acquires about in terms of pain regulation. So, sorry, to go back to my point, if understanding suicide as a death of pain, it's too much emotional sort of horror internally. So then if we think about how in a lot of cultures and communities, men might be socialized to have relationships with their emotions. If we start thinking about ideas about denying your pain, suppressing your vulnerability, being self-reliant, keeping that on the inside, and you layer that into a situation of somebody who's feeling overwhelming distress, I mean, Ali, it's such a cultural violence to be doing
Mm,
to, a group of people. So, you know, often in our research, we sort of see evidence of men saying that primarily in terms of their emotions, that relationship begins with yourself. Am I able to identify for myself what is triggering these feelings that I have inside of myself, and being therefore able, before you even start thinking about expressing and communicating to other people, what's my ability to sort of understand and make sense for myself? And so we
mhm.
saw evidence of men saying, that this disconnection happened for them in not being able to really understand always their emotional experience. And then, of course, feeling prohibited or limited in what they could express or communicate to other people. And so as more stresses and complications accumulate in life, there's more and more sort of building dysregulation inside. And then often men will talk about, when you're in pain, we're not passive to pain. Like the purpose of pain is to motivate us to do something, about it. Like if I put my hand into a flame, I feel pain so that my brain goes, take your hand out.
Yeah.
So the same thing with emotional pain. We're not passive to it. We want to try and find a way to relieve it. And if you're being told, don't talk about it with other people, then you have to come up with different solutions. And so we see a lot of evidence of men saying they would, you know, start doing things like, drinking or drugs, fighting, self-harm, gambling, harmful eating, sex, all these sort of behaviors that they were describing as pain relief behaviors, essentially, trying to alleviate some of the distress that was in their brains, or just turning the volume down on the thoughts in their head, trying to escape it for a while. And ultimately, these sort of pain relief behaviors are compounding your pain in the long term. So you can sort of get trapped in these cycles of you feel like shit. You try to do a behavior to stop you feeling so awful. And that behavior gives you a short-term release, but ultimately in the long term, it's making the
Mm,
pain worse. So I need to relieve my pain sort of more and more, and so on. So that's sort of thinking about, men's emotions. What I do want to caveat, Ali, when we talk about men's emotions, it's very real, these cultural norms of that being harmful to men's relationship with their emotions. At the same time, in my experience and through my work, when you give men who are suicidal space that's theirs, that's imbued with a genuine compassion for their experience, I have found men who are suicidal to be unbelievably emotionally articulate and wise, and have an incredible insight on what is happening for them, even if they don't necessarily feel kind of psychologically confident in terms of their ability to express what's going on for them. Actually, they have like an abundance of skills in that way. So that's sort of one area of life, looking at men's relationships with their emotions. And then, similarly, there are different harms in terms of men's relationships with themselves, how they think and feel about themselves, the pressures that they feel in terms of what constitutes a man of success. And for me, Ali, one of the biggest things that I had to learn very quickly as a woman doing this work is how enormous feelings of failure can be for men, and how aware men are of what makes a successful man and what makes an unsuccessful man, how aware they were of in which camp they felt they, resided. And so many men describing such painful feelings of failure that they're living with, that of course they're then sort of keeping to themselves. And then we see evidence of some men sort of creating this sort of performance of self, because they don't
mm,
feel able to tell anyone that they're struggling, or that they feel like they're failing. So they're presenting to the outside world as somebody happy, in control, and this sort of isolation emerges between what they're experiencing on the inside and what they're projecting on the outside. And of course, it's unbelievably tiring pretending. It is
yeah.
unbelievably tiring. And so that is also then taking an emotional and mental toll on men. And then the third area, thinking about men's relationships with others, thinking then about how men are socialized, how those cultural norms of masculinity impact the space for meaningful connection. If you're being told to suppress your emotions, if you're being told to be independent, stay in control, be self-reliant, all of that narrows the space in which to build meaningful intimacy with other people. So we're sort of culturally diminishing and denying men's human need for connection and belonging.
Mhm.
Sorry, Ali, I'm talking a lot. I kind of
No,
understand
I
that.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
No, I think we've, going through all of this, it's so helpful to kind of give these high level components, and maybe we can talk through them a little bit more as well. And I think the way you've described it makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, kind of as it relates to men's understanding of their emotions, but also kind of that through line in how they have relationships with others. One thing I've been hearing a little bit more recently, kind of in men's spaces, is this idea that with therapy or talk therapy or things like that, it's being argued as more of like this feminization of
Mm,
relationships, and that it's way more common for women to connect, to emotionally regulate by talking through deep things with their friends. And it's almost being talked about as not the best way, or not the way that men connect to their friends or with their emotions. And I'm just wondering, like, do you believe that being in touch with your emotions, being able to express those kind of deeper emotions with friends is kind of specific to women, or should remain specific to women?
Mm,
Or is that an important component for men to be
mm,
able to do, and to have those deeper friendships where they can, speak about the things that are going on for their life more deeply, not just about the sport, or, the game, or, their job? Like, do you think that's important, or do you think that there are other avenues that men can also utilize that can have the same impact on their emotional well-being?
mhm. I think it's a great question, Ali. And I think that one of the things that's tricky about talking about this issue is I talk about men as if they were one thing, and uh, men are unbelievably diverse.
Hmm.
Um, what works for one man is, repellent for another man. And I've spoken to men who've had amazing experiences with therapy, other men who really it doesn't suit them, it doesn't meet them where they are and what they need and what they're looking for. So I think that there has to be, what I want is a rich and diverse and judgment-free ecosystem of support
Mm.
for men, so that men who want therapy are able to access that without shame, in the same way that a man who doesn't want that, who wants to go and, I don't know, do some intense physical Ironman marathon because that helps release something. Like, also there's value in all of these things. Ultimately, you need to figure, every individual has to figure out for themselves how to regulate their pain in an effective way. And I think that's going to look different for different people. What I will say about this question about the feminization of men through therapy, I think we have to be so careful in terms of how we think about emotions, like em- emotions or feelings, or f- basically every single human being is having some kind of affect experience to life, like constantly through your life. Internally you are in some state of feeling, and that can go from unpleasant to pleasant, and you can experience it at a sort of low level frequency to a very high consuming level frequency, but that is humming away in the background all of the time. And as things happen in life, it can, the events that happen in life can change the dial on that, but it's going on inside of you all of the time. Now, encouraging men to have a better relationship with understanding what that internal data is telling them. So, if I had a boss, and let's say, for example, I had really horrific bullying when I was a child, and I'm now middle age, and I'm at work, and my boss says something that I interpret as being insulting of me. And these memories of childhood of this bullying is activated, but I don't have that relationship and that understanding to know that suddenly the dial on my emotions and feeling has gone cranked right up, and my brain's gone from 0 to 100, and I think my boss is the worst person that's ever existed, and I'm going to tell them to go fuck themselves, and I'm going to blow up my life. So this, I mean, it's kind of a simplistic, exaggerated example, but what I'm trying to say is that all of the time, the sort of dial on our emotions is being moved by our sort of internal experiences, our internal interpretations of what's happening, and external events, and encouraging men to have a better understanding of those dials, for me, is permitting them to embody their humanity more fully. It's nothing about making them more feminized. And really what I'm most passionate about is enabling men to have that better internal relationship. What you then choose to do with that relationship and that internal dialogue, whether you then choose to share that more with people, or whether it's just a useful tool to help you understand yourself better. I think that's, for each person to understand. And the other thing, Ali, that I think is really, really important, and that I don't think as women we're really necessarily aware of, is how hostile at times the public conversation can be about men. Now, I would never, ever, ever I would never share my most vulnerable pain in an environment wherein I felt there was hostility towards me in that environment, where there were
Mhm.
assumptions being made about my experience and who I might be that are diminishing of me. I'm not going to want to tell you the things that are most intimate, and particularly, people who are suicidal, who've often had challenging interpersonal things happen to them. Part of that pain can be about those things. Then needing to feel safe, needing to feel like you can trust those people to share your intimate pain with is so paramount. And I think that
Mhm.
there's this sort of strange sort of conflict at the moment in our public discourse about men, where we're sort of saying men need to talk more about their feelings, but also kind of sometimes really diminishing men as emotional beings or men as
Yeah.
feeling beings. And I think that's a really difficult place for a lot of men, to occupy, particularly if you're a man in deep pain.
Absolutely. And that's such a great point. I want to get to kind of that cultural conversation and how kind of women play into that too. But before we get there, just wanted to ask a little bit too, or talk a little bit more about that conversation. Yeah, around understanding your triggers, understanding what's going on for you internally, and having that connection to yourself. Because I think a lot of women, again, I'm just going to go back there for a minute. They're
Mm,
very interested in like the therapy space and understanding their childhood and why they are the way that they are. And I think a lot of that could benefit men too, just in terms of just getting to know themselves a little better. You don't have to do anything with it, like you said.
yeah.
That's a really smart point. But one thing that it made me wonder about is this idea that, if we are, which I think is harmful to begin with, thinking that like therapy or emotions are these female things and that
Hmm.
men shouldn't even experience them or talk about them, is almost like, is there a component, do you think, that men want to kind of hold on to their masculinity by not leaning into anything that can be perceived as feminine? Or even what you were saying earlier, if a man is struggling or with feelings of failure, voicing that almost, it puts it out into the world, it makes it real. Whereas if it's
Yeah.
just internal, maybe no one else knows. And do you feel like there's a reluctance to voice, to express, to explore, because it enables that vulnerability, or that feeling of like, oh gosh, I'm getting into this like emotional state that I don't want to be in? And like, why do you think there's so much resistance there?
Mm. I think it really, really varies. So I think that what you're describing is very true for certain men. Absolutely. And I think also it's in part a coping mechanism. If you've had experiences in life where you've been emotionally not cared for and had to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, it's so difficult to give up that coping strategy and start to trust that this might be a safe space. I think if you take a lot of your identity value from being the person that takes care of other people, protects other people, then it's very difficult to understand yourself as a potential recipient of care. And I think
Mm,
that's true for certain men. Some of the evidence we saw in terms of barriers to help seeking was men saying, I don't want to take a place in the system that someone else might need more than me. So this sort of
mm,
beautiful, caring instincts coming through, or feeling like they were the ones that had to take care of their families. It comes through this theme also comes through in suicide notes that we've seen of men being like, I will, feeling in some ways that you can't live up to those that desire to be a protector in this world because of circumstances and things that might be going on, and then wanting to fulfill that in the afterlife, of wanting to look after, protect, look over, your loved ones, which I find so kind of deeply, deeply, moving. I think it's really, really important that we are saying to men that getting in touch with your emotions is nothing, nothing, nothing about being more feminine. Like I say, the message for me is about embodying more your humanity, and that, like I say, part of the human experience is having a feeling response to existence. So you understanding your feelings better is just being able to embody that human experience more. I think it's really, really, really important that there are spaces just for men where men can gather and talk to each other in the way that they want to talk to each other, to share. I don't. In the UK, we've got these beautiful, beautiful groups emerging of peer support groups. Groups in different communities. They can look different. Some of them are like talk clubs. It's just men gathering and talking about things that are going on for them. Some of them are activity based, like cold water swimming, football, building sheds, making pies. I've heard of men like doing knitting groups in libraries, like motorbike stuff, all these different ways. But I think the importance of men coming together and normalizing their struggles. I think as women, like, I felt like a failure at times, but I know that all the women around me feel like that too. So I don't feel like my feelings of failure are uniquely condemning of me as a woman. Whereas I think for a lot of men, when that sharing isn't happening, sorry, it starts to be so much more catastrophic in how you internalize it as something kind of just happening to you. The other thing,
Yeah.
Ali, that I think is really, really important is having patience with understanding. And I make the point for us as women that I don't know when you were born, Ali, but I grew up in the 90s. And in the 90s, in terms of women's bodies, what was held up was size zero. This is what
Yeah.
the ideal woman should look like, a size zero. And of course, that then shaped all of the women and myself's relationship with our bodies. And now it's 2025 and we have all this beautiful body positivity messaging, but it doesn't mean that every woman I know now feels absolutely fantastic about their like physical appearance.
Yeah.
These ideas have seeped in and shaped us over years and years and years. And it's the same
Right.
with men. We can't suddenly just say to men, oh, do you know what? All that time when we said don't talk about your feelings, you don't really need to worry about that. Now actually,
Right.
we got that wrong. You should really talk about your feelings, and maybe you should even think about how you felt as a child and how that may be impacting you that now. Like, it's for a lot of people it's a really difficult process starting
Mm.
to understand what's safe for you to do. And we do see evidence sometimes. I call it like a cultural lag of some men sort of caught between these old cultural norms and these new norms. So for example, in terms of talking about their feelings or going and getting help, we've seen evidence of men saying, I would never judge another man or a man I knew for going to get help. I wouldn't judge them for that, but I cannot bring myself to do it.
Mm.
So it's like being caught between, like, I understand that this behavior's okay and acceptable, but I cannot bring myself to do it because of all of
Yeah.
these years of internalization that have maybe happened around it. So all of this, Ali, is so complicated. And really, if we're not talking to one another, if we're not making it safe for us to
Mm.
talk to one another, we cannot really understand the complexity of what's going on for each other. And we are deeply, deeply entwined. I know that you've got beautiful, brilliant men in your life that you want to be well.
Mm-hmm.
And the same for me, as women. And they're in the same way that there are things that for us as women that make our lives difficult or scary or traumatic at times. And I need the men around me to understand what those things might be and to contribute to helping to change that reality. And it's vice versa. I cannot say, Ali, how much this work has changed my understanding of the male experience. Like, it's been unbelievable. And I've been so privileged that this work has brought me into contact with so many beautiful, beautiful men.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. That was such a great example comparing it to your understanding of your body as women, because I think that just clicked for me
mm,
100% of, something's okay now does not mean you can undo 30 years of
Yeah.
conditioning or 20 years of conditioning, however long that song has been in your head of, size zero, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
That is such an interesting point. And maybe we could talk a little bit about how women play into this, because you're absolutely right. Like with women's issues, we always ask men to be allies, or we kind of give that reference of we're your mother, your sister, your daughter, and vice versa. Like these men are our husbands, our sons, our uncles. And so how do you envision, especially because my audience is a large part women, like how can women show up for the men in their lives or contribute to undoing some of
Mm,
this stigma in the culture, or helping kind of propel men forward into a better place where they do feel safer, less confined into that box of masculinity? Like, what is our role?
mm. It's a great question. And I mean, I'll speak personally from my experience of, so I grew up with three brothers, Ali. So, and we were four of us 4 years apart. So we were incredibly close in age, and we were incredibly close as a group. And so I was raised in male energy in that way. And I've always had a deep affection and like pleasure in being in masculine energy. So I came into this work, I suppose, as somebody who understood themselves as having a kind of deep love for men. And I cannot tell you how much it was revealed to me through this work that I just did not know men at all. And so for me, in order to do this work effectively, it's sort of an ongoing excavation of my own gender biases. You will be holding deep gender biases as well. And they show up in different ways in every day of our life, as all kinds of biases do. And I'm not saying that's your fault or my fault. Like, we're raised in the societies that we're raised in. We didn't sit down and architect what we wanted these norms to be. But so it's sort of holding compassion for the existence and the reality of those biases, but also taking them responsibility for trying to understand what they are and how they might be, like limiting how we come alongside men in our lives. And for me now, I've had conversations with hundreds and hundreds of men who are suicidal, and I've heard about horrendous abuse that's happened to them: emotional, physical, sexual, psychological traumas that they've experienced, relationship breakdowns, unemployment, addiction challenges, caregiver abandonment, parental alienation, adult relationship victims of domestic abuse, coercive control, all kinds of things that start to, I didn't hear those stories before. And so when I met men and interacted with men, I didn't look at them through the lens as people that can be deeply harmed by life. And I think that for me, that the best way to sort of start showing up alongside men is to start excavating those gender biases, so we can start really listening to them, but also understanding that the men in your life may not want to talk to you.
Hmm.
I think particularly for certain men, there's a pleasure and a purpose they derive from being that, from the strength that they want to envelop the people around them with, and understanding that and saying, what's important for me is that you go and find a space where you can start to effectively regulate that pain. And what I can do within that, I want to do, but I also understand that I may not be the best person for that, or there may be other spaces that you want to go and do that, at the same time. And understanding that the way that men cope may not look like the way we as women may choose to do that. And understanding, I remember speaking to a man who was suicidal, who had a family and a partner, and for him, gaming was, he said, when he was gaming, it was a few hours of the day when his brain was not consumed by thoughts of suicide and stress and anxiety. And it's easy to look at that behavior when potentially as his female partner, and being like, you know,
Yeah.
we've got a family here. What are you doing? But
Right.
actually, you know, if they'd been able to have a dialogue to understand it, actually, this was really, really precious regulatory time for him in this period of crisis that he was in, whereby he was getting some respite from the kinds of
Hmm.
like, you know, violent thoughts. And I'm going off topic slightly from what you're saying now, but I do think in terms of regulation, it can be useful to think about short term and long term. So there's short-term regulatory tools that are just in it, like moment to moment, going to just stop the, you know, shit show that might be going on in your brain. And then there are
Yeah.
like longer-term regulatory things, like, for example, therapy, like exploring what's happened in your childhood and how might that be affecting my emotion, my internal um, emotional dial, you know, that are really valuable as well. But yeah, just to go back to the gender biasing, the something that I really understood about myself, and I don't know, Ali, if you'll relate to this, is I call it the like yeah, but men. And you know, there's a part of your knee that if you hit it, it like kicks out
Yeah, yeah, yep.
like a reflex.
Yep.
I think of yeah, but men as that similar reflex, and I really noticed that this journey of research, it began with, you know, I was at a point when I started it where I probably said it out loud. Someone would say something that was about men, you know, that was more compassionate about men, and people go, yeah, but men. And then eventually I start, that voice became internal, but I would still hear it at times. And it was a long process for me. Now I never hear it, Ali. I never ever hear it. And for me now, I know that I can do good work because
Hmm.
I'm, you know, that instinct, that yeah, but men,
Yep.
you know, Ali, if you were telling your problems to someone and my instinct in response to you all the time was, yeah, but Ali,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean? It's so horrendous.
Totally.
Um,
I think a lot of women can relate to that. And I think even just like the cultural conversation around feminism and patriarchy and like so much so valid. And I think a lot of women, um, have experienced a lot of negative things from men in their life, whether that's partners or parents, or, there's lots of reasons why women might feel distrusting of men or have had really negative experiences with men. Not all of them, but maybe some really impactful ones in their life. And I think for people who've had that, it's really easy to, you're right, just say, okay, I get it, but, you know, like even just like the blame of like, well, you shaped the culture, like this is men's doing in the first place. I bet you someone could argue that. Or just feeling like, yeah, there's that knee-jerk reaction of, okay, I get it, but there's this other part of blame, which, yeah, when you say it out loud, like that's horrible to think and to just like knee jerk that way. um but a really interesting point and a really good call out, even for myself, who I've definitely thought that way. I'm not going to lie about certain
yeah.
things in the past.
Yeah, and I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I think the complexity of all of this is so, because you know a lot of women have had a traumatic history with certain men, and of course then it shapes you, it shapes how you think about men, the language you might use. I would also say that through my work, I've come into contact with a lot of men who've had a traumatic history with women. And
Exactly.
that then shapes how they think and feel about women. But there's more permission and safety for us to say certain things about men because of the way that we've been harmed. That as a man who's been harmed by women, he's already, you know, he may be cast as a misogynist, as an incel,
Right.
as a potential whatever. And I think that I really realized during this work that when I thought about men, like prior to doing this work, when I thought about men, I'd been sort of socially encouraged to pick up a telescope and look at men with the lens of the worst men I've ever known on
Right.
the end of the telescope. And when I took that lens off and put on the lens of the best men I've ever known, it totally changes your view. And when you know, I would love people listening to this to sort of afterwards just take a time to reflect on the great men that have been in your life, the beautiful men that have happened to you. Like I always talk about my older brother because his love and care and tenderness and support, protection, I don't know that I would be here without him. He's made me, in part, who I am. have a tremendous debt to him. And, other men that have been in my life, male teachers, male friends, male collaborators, male colleagues. Like I say in this work, Ali, I've met so many beautiful men doing,
Hmm.
really incredible, moving, meaningful work in their, community. And it has to be reciprocal. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like we have to
Yeah.
build this bridge between the genders, but I think that we also have to celebrate the contribution that men and masculinity can make to our societies and lives, and really understand what we mean by that and not be afraid. But
Hmm.
I say that respectfully, Ali, for why that fear can exist for many people, and not just women. There are, of course, men who've been traumatized by other men as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's so weird that there's always this, war conflict between the genders, and there's this competition of who's struggling more, who's had it worse. And it's like if we all just see each other for our humanity, life would be so much better. But you're right. Like one thing in culture though I'm noticing is I think we've swung a little too far. We were really anti-misogyny and that was great. We don't want that.
Mm,
But I'm seeing a lot of like almost acceptable misandry, or it's not
mm,
getting called out to the same degree. And I
mm.
think we just need to find that balance again because I think it's getting a little much on the side of villainizing men for a lot of different things that again, sure, there's a lot of horrible men in this world. There's a lot of horrible women in this world. But for
Yeah.
the most part, most people are not that
Oh,
way.
wonderful. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, I completely agree. And once you start dialing into it, you start to, you do see it everywhere. I talk a lot about, I went to a big museum in London maybe a year ago, and in their gift shop they had a card that on the front of the card it says, "I like everybody, even men." And I just thought, like, what other group of people in society in 2024 it was,
Yeah.
um, could you say that about and put it on a card in a gift shop in a
Totally.
mainstream London museum? It's and men and boys are seeing this and they're internalizing it. And
Hmm.
I talk a bit about, you know, growing up as a queer person and the conversation in the 80s and 90s about homosexuality and the ideas then that I internalized as a young person and the seeds of shame that get planted in your selfhood and your identity, that even now at 43, you're still kind of discovering new weeds of it and trying to plant flowers instead. But I think that there are, I get messages from young boys, and I see a similar experience happening to them now of
Hmm.
being told and internalizing. And I'm not saying that they're directly the same, but that danger to identity and self-esteem and your ideas of social value that comes when you feel like you're receiving messages from the broader culture that you're somehow unwanted or there's something shameful or abhorrent about who you are is so, so, so corrosive to the, to well-being. And, it does concern me.
Hmm. Well, it's almost like too, you don't want to do the thing that hurt you. Like I think for a lot of women, it's like they've received a lot of negative messages about themselves, their bodies, they've been objectified, all of these horrible things. And so to, do something almost similarly damaging in the culture to the other side, it's not helpful and it's not making anything better. And I think if you even thought of it as a woman from like a purely selfish perspective, not that you should, But it's like, this is 50% of the population. Like you, your children, everyone you
Mm-hmm.
know, like we all have to coexist and it's going to keep going. Like new generations are coming through and like how do you want that? What road do you want that to go down? And I think I'm thinking about it even more because I have a son who's a
Right.
baby right now, but it's
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, imagine him growing up in a culture where he thinks he's defective because he's a boy or that he is not going to be as successful or he's going to be not in control of his emotions and he can't do XYZ and it's like all these harmful things that you would never want and maybe women thinking like, oh yeah, like we used to have because I'm a girl and that was like a negative thing, like because you were a
Mm-hmm.
girl you couldn't do all these things. We don't want it in the inverse either. And it's like how can we all take care of each other moving forward? Like I think it's so important to think about. But you're so
Mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm. And the importance then, I think, of just understanding each other's experience and having,
Hmm.
that kind of deep dialogue. And, like I say, I come into contact with a very specific group of men. So I can't speak to, all men, but the group that I come into contact with are men who've been deeply harmed by life, by other people, by, structural conditions, economic, cultural factors, and carrying an incredible amount of pain that that society has allowed them to become so isolated with.
Mm.
Um, One of the things that impacted me most, that I found so kind of devastating, was speaking to a man who'd been bereaved by another man in his family, and he said the day that this person died, he texted him to tell him that he loved him. So he messaged you and said, love you. And then he said, look after, and he said the name of his son. And he said the moment he got that message, he knew something awful was happening because this man had never told him that he loved him.
Mm.
And for me, Ali, like that is symbolic so much of I think some of the deep, deep cultural violence that's happening to men. To be for the first time in your life, to be expressing to someone that you love them, to be the day that you're also ending your life, is so unbelievably horrendous. And
Mm.
for that other man to receive that message of love and to see
Yeah.
that therefore as a sign that something awful was happening,
Yeah.
is also really, really disturbing. If you think, Ali, about what makes your life meaningful, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but for me, it's the bonds of love that I have created and nurtured and shared with people.
Hmm.
That's ultimately, you strip everything else away. That's the thing that I'm going to want to keep hold of. And when we think about privilege, and I compare myself to my brothers, I think I've been way more privileged to be able to build and nurture and sustain those bonds of love with people. Now, of course, there's a million complicated things that are going on, but I think for us to really start to understand the deep, deep harms that are happening in our society and cultures for certain men is really, really important, and expanding our muscle of compassion
Hmm.
for the male experience.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about, yeah, we're on the topic of a little bit of like antidotes and supports. And so I know you've mentioned groups and there's communities popping up for men to connect with one another. We've talked a little bit about patience and compassion from women and other folks in men's lives that can support them. Um, in that kind of slow
Mm,
transition or even just understanding their experience, are there any other antidotes, let's call them, or supports that we can take forth with us
yeah.
to help aid in this really
Yeah.
traumatic, horrendous experience that's happening?
I mean, in some ways, if we go back to that chord of pain, those three notes,
Hmm.
I think in terms of managing your suicidal pain, it's like, how do I build effective regulation in those three areas? So in terms of my emotions, and we see evidence of this with men as well, is like, how can men be supported to recognize their need for emotional regulation, to reconnect with that area of their life and start then to regulate it. And that's going to look differently at different points in your life. Like, I've definitely spoken to men who've had so much complexity and trauma in their life. It's like this huge tidal wave is suspended
Mm.
over their head of grief for the suffering that they've lived through. And they've said to me, if I went to therapy and started exploring it, I'm afraid, essentially I might drown if I let that tidal
Yeah.
wave crash down upon me. So it's respecting what each person needs at different points. And it may be that you need to do, like I always say, it's a bit like looking directly at the sun. We don't do that. Like, you have to sort of get protective glasses, or you've got to build up to it. So for some people, maybe they need to build up more tolerance in a way before they start doing the more intensive work that often happens therapeutically in terms of understanding where all of that emotional pain comes from.
Right.
The second one around, that second note about how can you start to change your relationship with yourself. And Ali, that's so difficult. Like, if you've lived for a long time with a deep feeling of feeling shitty about yourself, it's really, really, it's a long road to start to show compassion towards yourself, particularly if, in your formative years as a child, compassion wasn't and care weren't, extended to you, which is, can sometimes happen for men who are suicidal. I think one of the beautiful things about peer support is that it's the reciprocal nature of it. So for some men, it's important that you're not just passively receiving help, but in those peer support groups, you can also offer help to
Right.
other people. And again, something like that can start to change how you feel about yourself, to start to see, oh, I can matter to people and offer extended care to people and support people. So, and then the third one about our relationships with other people, again, what can you as an individual, what do you need? What would being in closer relationship with people look like? And again, that's going to differ on where you are. I remember reading we did a survey about help seeking, and one of the participants wrote that essentially if I went to get help, I would have to extensively self-harm in order to deal with the anxiety of leaving the house.
Mm.
So a person, a man living in that situation is, going to start to build. How can he build meaningful connection? It might look different than another man who's not in that same state of being. Maybe this person, it looks more like starting to build online community and then strengthening that muscle and eventually sort of extending it outwards in different ways. But I suppose, Ali, what I'm essentially saying is that strengthening your muscles in those three areas of your life, however that looks like, as long as
Hmm.
it's not harming anybody else, let us celebrate it. Is the important thing, I think. I don't know if that made sense. What
Yeah. No,
I've
absolutely.
pinged about a bit.
Yeah. And then I think even just from like a person who is living alongside someone who might be dealing with suicidal ideation or thoughts, what are your recommendations there? Obviously, compassion, understanding. What else?
It's my heart goes out to those people. I've lived that reality myself, and there's so many people around the world who are on the front line of a mental health crisis for a loved one, and you're untrained to be in that role. And it's also, you're watching sometimes one of the people you love most in the world be at risk, and you don't know what the right thing to do is. I described, it's like you're carrying the person you love on a tightrope and you're blindfolded, and you've got to take
Mm.
each step not knowing if the rope is going to be beneath you. I have real compassion for people that are both living with that suicidal pain and people who are worried about loved ones. I think you've got to, as much as possible, and it's really difficult, is keep yourself as well as possible in that, because it's like mental torture at times. It's
Mm.
really distressing and frightening. At the same time, for me, and I don't want to it's really delicate talking about this because you don't know how people are going to understand the point that you're trying to make. But for me, feeling suicidal at times is completely normal. Like for me, it's just a normal part of the repertoire of responses one will have to life at different points. Sometimes life is a place, what's happening in your life, you feel joyful and euphoric and excited and energized. And sometimes you feel absolutely fucking horrific to the point where you're questioning whether you can keep going. So for me, like, there's this delicate balance between normalizing those feelings. You don't have to be afraid of someone feeling that way. It's can be a natural response. At the same time, you've really got to take those sorts of feelings seriously because you don't want to let them lead you in a direction that you don't ultimately, want to go. So there's this delicate balance of like normalizing something whilst taking it kind of incredibly seriously. But I suppose I want to say to anybody who might be feeling suicidal is it's really for me kind of a natural way to feel at certain times in your life. And we see, Ali, as well, huge fluctuation in thoughts and feelings. I observe that in myself. Like I can feel incredibly low in the morning and then by the evening,
Yeah.
you know, be kind of excited about something that's coming up. And sometimes you kind of give yourself whiplash in a way that your feelings can kind of change so quickly. But something that I found really useful in terms of kind of making sense of things is there's suicidologist called David Rudd who's developed this fluid vulnerability model. And basically the idea is that every one of us has baseline risk for suicide because all of us experience painful, difficult things in our lives. So if you think of kind of like suicidal pain in a tank that's building up,
Hmm.
we're all going to experience painful things in our life and our tanks might reach the point where so he distinguishes between this baseline risk and then you've hit some kind of threshold where the suicidal mode is activated. Now, when the suicidal mode is activated, of course, it's scary because there is a potential danger to life. But his theory is really interesting because he's saying basically those emotions are so intense to inhabit you can't sustain them indefinitely. So I think of somebody at the gym, like lifting a really heavy weight. Your body cannot hold that weight indefinitely. At a certain point, you've got to put it down. So for me, that was kind of helpful in terms of making sense of myself or supporting a loved one is kind of knowing that we're in this sort of suicidal storm
Yeah.
and there's going to be ebbs and flows in it. And I'm not saying that when you're in the storm, it's really scary and it's difficult. But what can you do when that storm subsides to put in kind of protections for yourself so that when the
Right.
storm hits again, you can be a bit more kind of buffered? Because most of the time, most of us, when we come out of that storm, we want to still be alive.
Hmm.
And so it's how can I take care of me, the me that goes into that's in that storm, potentially in a later date, to make sure that we don't move in the direction of travel that ultimately the me that's outside of that storm, doesn't want to go. And I say that with tremendous compassion for, some people are in cycles of, repeated storms over and over and over and over. But I've spoken to so many men who've found a way to create toolkits to manage those storms. And the purpose of my work, I suppose, in a way, is to help facilitate more men to create and access those things.
No, that was beautiful. I think, oh gosh, we've covered so much, and I still feel like we've only scratched the surface in terms of
Mm.
what we could get into and the whole cultural conversation behind it as well. But to wrap up here, if listeners could take one thing away from our conversation today, what would you want it to be?
I'd love them to take away, I guess, deeper curiosity about the men in their lives and what those men are experiencing. And even if it doesn't, I don't think that will necessarily mean that every man's going to want to stop and tell you all about their deepest secrets, but to start just internally being curious about what might be going on and start to be alert to your own yeah, but men reflexes and how can you start to challenge that? But yeah, I think it's Ali, we need each other so much. We need each other so, so deeply. And the some of the best medicine we have is our compassion. When you're in suicidal pain, that compassion can be so, can be life-saving. And it's something that we all possess, or most of us possess to some extent. And I think whatever actions that can help us extend that, like I say, muscle of compassion more richly in the direction of men who are suicidal is really critical.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then, very lastly, where can people get connected, find out more about you?
And the main place is on Instagram. So I've got an Instagram page, which is male_suicide_research. And I try to share findings and ideas and things, in kind of like hopefully kind of like a visual and interesting, accessible way, because ultimately the research belongs to the people. And so I try as much as possible to try and put it back in the hands of the people that might need it most.
Dr. Susie Bennett, thank you so much for being here. This was such an incredible conversation and such an
Thank
important
you
one
for
to have.
having
So,
me.
thank you.
Thank you.